Okay, let's just be honest for a second. For a lot of people, the Book of Leviticus is like hitting a brick wall, right? It's full of all these detailed laws about sacrifices and purity that can seem, well, strange, maybe even irrelevant. But what if it's actually one of the most important books for understanding the entire biblical story? In this explainer, we're going to demystify Leviticus and show you the powerful and honestly beautiful ideas at its core. So, let's dive in.
So, if you remember at the end of the last book, Exodus, something absolutely incredible happens. God, in all his holy, powerful glory, comes to live among the Israelites in this tent called the tabernacle. But that creates a massive problem. You see, God's presence is kind of like the sun. It's the source of all life and all goodness, but if you get too close without the right protection, it's actually really dangerous. So the huge question that Leviticus is built to answer is this: how can a sinful, imperfect people possibly survive living right next door to a pure, holy God?
And this is exactly where Leviticus comes in. It is not just some random list of rules. You have to think of it as God's instruction manual. It's his gracious guide, showing Israel exactly how to navigate this new, really high-stakes reality. It provides a way for them to approach him, to deal with their impurity, and to live together in a way that actually reflects his own holy character.
Okay, so to get a handle on all this, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the offerings and how to approach God. Then, the role of the priests as holy mediators. After that, we'll get into what it meant to live a holy life, that whole clean and unclean thing. Then we'll zoom out to see a holy nation's rhythms, and finally, we'll land on the core choice that Israel had to make.
All right, let's start at the very beginning, the sacrificial system. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus lay out these incredibly detailed rituals. And these weren't it's about punishment for doing wrong. They were the main bridge that allowed an imperfect person to walk into that sacred space and connect with a perfect God.
And what's so fascinating here is that these offerings weren't all about sin. Not at all. They actually covered the entire spectrum of a relationship. You had the burnt offering, which was like saying, I want to be right with you. The meal offering was just a simple way to say thank you. And the peace offering, that was literally about sharing a meal with God, about fellowship. And then, of course, you had the sin and guilt offerings to deal with mistakes and make things right, both with God and with your neighbor.
But who could actually do all this, perform these sacred rituals? Well, it couldn't be just anyone. God set apart a special group of people to stand in the gap between him and the Israelites, the priests.
So chapters 8 and 9 walk us through this incredibly detailed 7-day ceremony to ordain Aaron and his sons. They're washed, they're clothed in special garments, and they're anointed with oil and blood. This whole process was designed to show everyone that they were being set apart, consecrated for a uniquely dangerous and holy job, representing the people before God and representing God before the people.
And just as we see the process done right, Leviticus immediately shows us what happens when it's done wrong. Aaron's own 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, they just barge into God's presence on their own terms, offering what the text calls strange fire, something God had not commanded. And the result is absolutely terrifying. Fire comes out from God's presence and consumes them. This story just brilliantly illustrates the central theme. God is holy, and you must approach him on his terms, not your own. It's a matter of life and death.
After this shocking event, God gives the reason why. And this quote, this is really the key to the entire book. He says, he will be treated as holy by those who come near him. His holiness isn't a suggestion, you see. It's a reality, and it has to be respected for any kind of relationship to be possible.
So how did this whole idea play out in daily life? Well, the concept of holiness wasn't just for the priests inside the tabernacle. It was meant to shape the everyday lives of every single Israelite through what we now call the purity laws.
Okay, and this is a really crucial point we have to get right. What does unclean mean here? It's not about being sinful or physically dirty. Think of it more like this. Imagine trying to walk into a perfectly sterile operating room while you're covered in mud. You're not evil, you're just not compatible with that environment. So being unclean meant you were temporarily in a state that was associated with death or disorder, and you just couldn't enter the sacred space of God's presence until you went through a process to be made clean again.
These laws touched pretty much every part of life. They spelled out which animals were clean and suitable for God's people to eat. They addressed normal life events like childbirth, serious issues like skin diseases, and even something like mildew growing in a house. All of these things symbolically touched on the boundaries between life and death, or order and disorder.
These practices were a constant, daily reminder to the Israelites that God's holiness mattered in every single part of their existence.
So from these individual purity rules, the book kind of zooms out and widens its scope to how the entire nation of Israel was supposed to live out its unique calling as a holy people. This wasn't just about personal piety. It was about the very structure of their community.
And the absolute peak of Israel's ritual calendar was the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, which is laid out in chapter 16. This was the one day all year that the high priest, and only the high priest, would go behind that famous veil into the most holy place, the very center of God's presence, to make atonement for the sins of the entire nation. It was the big one.
A huge part of this day involved 2 goats. One was sacrificed, and its blood was used to purify the tabernacle itself from all the spiritual gunk Israel's sin had caused over the year. The second goat, the famous scapegoat, had the sins of the people confessed over its head before it was sent out into the wilderness, literally carrying their sin away. It's such a powerful picture, right? It shows that sin is both paid for and physically removed from the community.
Now, beyond this one super important day, Israel's entire year was built around a rhythm of sacred feasts. These festivals, like Passover or the Feast of Tabernacles, were annual reminders of who God was and what He had done for them. They were constantly recentering the nation's identity on their special relationship with Him.
But, and this is so important, holiness wasn't only about rituals. Leviticus makes it crystal clear that to be a holy nation meant you had to be a just and ethical nation. These chapters are filled with laws about treating people fairly. You find rules setting up clear sexual ethics, commands to care for the poor and the immigrant, and instructions for being honest in business. Holiness had to be lived out in how you treated your neighbor, period.
And right here, smack in the middle of all these laws, we find this absolute gem. It's one of the most famous commands in the entire Bible, one that Jesus himself quoted as the second greatest commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. This shows you the deep relational heart that's beating underneath all the rules and rituals of Leviticus.
The book even created a radical economic system to reflect God's justice. Every 50 years was called a year of Jubilee. And on this year, all debts were canceled, all slaves were set free, and all land was returned to its original family. I mean, it was a complete social and economic reset button, a built-in mechanism to stop long-term poverty and oppression. What a truly revolutionary idea.
And all of this brings us to the book's big conclusion. After laying out this entire blueprint for holy living, God, speaking through Moses, sets a very clear choice before the people of Israel.
Chapter 26 lays out the consequences of this choice in really stark terms. If they obey and walk in these ways of holiness, they will experience God's blessing, peace, security, and His presence right there with them. But if they reject these instructions and defile themselves and the land, they'll face disaster and ultimately be exiled from the very land God gave them. The stakes could not be higher.
So when we step back and look at the whole picture, we see that Leviticus isn't a book about an angry God who's just looking for a reason to zap people with rules. It's the exact opposite. It's a story of a holy God who wants to live with His people so badly that He graciously provides a detailed blueprint, a way for them to deal with their sin and impurity so they can actually enjoy a close, life-giving relationship with Him.
And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. The specific rituals might have changed, but the core principles of Leviticus are timeless, aren't they? A radical vision for justice, a deep concern for the poor, a call for a community to reflect God's good character. These ideas are still incredibly powerful. So it makes you wonder, what does it mean for any society to pursue that kind of holiness today?